everyone. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you, as well as Professor Diana Mutz of the University of Pennsylvania, who will deliver the inaugural Davis Lecture today. The Davis Lecture series has been established by Kim and Judy Davis. I'm very happy to have them both and their daughter, Lauren, with us in the audience today. Kim and Judy are enthusiastic supporters of Radcliffe's mission to foster inquiry across disciplinary boundaries, to convene faculty and students from all of Harvard schools, and to share the fruits of deep research with the public. Their generosity has established this series to bring leading thinkers to Radcliffe Yard for the purpose of tackling important questions in all fields, whether the arts, sciences, or, as we will hear today, the social sciences. On your chairs, you will find an announcement demonstrating the breadth of topics that we can look forward to in the Davis Lectures next year. So thank you, Kim and Judy, for your support, and especially for this invaluable lecture series. The Davis Lectures join the Radcliffe Institute's wide array of programs dedicated to ideas at work in the world. In just over 2 weeks, on May 27th, we will celebrate Radcliffe Day, the traditional culmination of our academic year. On that day, we will honor the life and work of Janet Yellen, the chair of the Federal Reserve, with a panel discussion entitled Building an Economy for Prosperity and Equality. We will hear personal remarks from former Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, and we will observe a conversation between Harvard Professor of Economics Greg Mankiw and Yellen herself. The whole day will be live streamed on our website, and video will be posted soon thereafter. I hope you will tune in. Along with the Davis Lectures next year, we have a wide range of additional programming planned. We'll be holding conferences on topics ranging from oceans and the international refugee crisis to universities' relationship with slavery and the global explosion of cities. And we will hear lectures from scientists, artists, novelists, and activists, among many others. And a full calendar will be available on our website by the end of this month, and I hope to see you many times in the year ahead. But back to today, as we happily inaugurate the Davis Lectures by welcoming Professor Diana Mutz, the Samuel A. Stauffer Professor of Political Science and Communications and the Director of the Institute for the Study of Citizens and Politics at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Mutz earned her PhD at Stanford University, and she taught at the University of Wisconsin and the Ohio State University before arriving at the University of Pennsylvania in 2003. She has written many books, including most recently, In Your Face Politics, The Consequences of Uncivil Media, which was published in 2015. Professor Mutz has been an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 2008, and in 2011, she won the Lifetime Career Achievement Award in Political Communication from the American Political Science Association. Just this spring, she was named a Guggenheim Fellow for 2016. She won that Guggenheim to support her work on the very topic that she will be discussing with us today: how the public understands globalization and how that understanding shapes individuals' political preferences. Professor Mutz's new project grows out of her long-standing interest in the causes and effects of public opinion. One of her most influential early books, entitled Impersonal Influence: How Perceptions of Mass Collectives Affect Political Attitudes, looked beyond traditional elite sources to learn more about important long-term trends. In Impersonal Influences, Mutz took a new critical look at polling data and opinion surveys. And her findings recast what we thought we knew about how individuals make up their minds on a range of issues, from the controversial to the mundane. She argued that well-publicized poll results can cause individuals to shape their own views in response to what the polls identify as widely shared attitudes and experiences. In other words, she discovered that sometimes individuals shift their views significantly in order to align themselves with visible trends. Her findings amounted to a sea change from an older view of polls as merely reflecting some pre-existing reality to a fresh appreciation of how poll results actually shape a new reality. Professor Mutz's field is political science, but in true Radcliffe interdisciplinary fashion, her work resonates with a paradigm shift that affected my own field of US history. Just as political science once focused primarily on elite thought and political actions, so the study of history once centered chiefly on the works and deeds of elite leaders. Then, starting in the 1960s, historians began investigating the past from the bottom up, as the expression went, looking at sources left behind by ordinary Americans and more marginalized groups to understand better their particular historical experiences. So my work as an historian grew out of that shift. For example, in my book, A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America, I investigated the difference it made politically for ordinary Americans to identify primarily as consumers rather than producers. I was interested in how the explosion of mass consumption in the years following World War II had impacts beyond the marketplace in helping shift the political, economic, and ideological orientations of Americans. Using opinion polls and consumer surveys, among many other sources, I learned that ordinary Americans believed that as mass consumers, they not only improved their personal standard of living, but they also boosted the nation's economy, and they helped demonstrate the superiority of capitalism over communism in the global Cold War. Consuming, moreover, was far from a passive act politically. Many Americans used their power as consumers to endorse, to boycott, and to protest products, producers, and retailers that they felt did harm, socially and materially. The American political economy that I chronicle in A Consumer's Republic was not a timeless one. In recent years, we have been feeling the effects of the end of that political economy and the transition to a new post-industrial economy. We tend to group these changes under the label globalization. Globalization is not new. It began at least in the early modern era of the 16th century, but its manifestations in the past 30 years have been unique. Trade policy has often instigated political controversy, and as we are seeing in this current election cycle, it continues to spark vigorous debate. Campaign rallies for candidates as disparate as Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders reach fever pitch when their candidates bash free trade. Hillary Clinton finds herself under fire for her earlier support of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. Before John Kasich quit the race for the Republican nomination, he frequently had to defend himself for supporting NAFTA. And after facing criticism for supporting the so-called Trade Promotion Authority bill last year, Ted Cruz tried to salvage his now defunct candidacy by reversing course and labeling the same bill a corrupt swindle. He even ran a television ad in the Wisconsin primaries promising to, and I quote, "bring our jobs back from China." So it's putting it mildly to say that Americans feel very strongly about the issue of free trade. The work that Professor Mutz will share with us today, I hope, will help us understand better the intense emotion that surrounds debates over the impact of global trade on the US. So now let me tell you a little bit about how today will work. First, Professor Mutz will deliver her lecture, and at the end there'll be time for you to ask questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please come up to the microphone we will set up in the center aisle. And when your turn comes, we'd like you to introduce yourself and then ask your question. Finally, I hope you will join us for a reception for Professor Mutz and our audience, for you too, right here in the Knaufel Center at the conclusion of today's event. So now, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Diana Mutz.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Liz, for that warm introduction, and thank you also to Judy and Kim for making this opportunity possible. The work I'm talking about is very much work in progress, so I very much look forward to your comments and ideas as I proceed through it. During my own lifetime, I think one of the most dramatic changes that I've seen in the world is the growing interconnectedness of people and countries all around the world. And this is partly due to developments in communications and also transportation as well. We seem, in one way, more interconnected than ever before. And it's for this particular reason that I found this graph rather surprising. This is the percentage of people who think it'll be best for the future of our country if we stay out of world affairs. Now, interpret that item as you will, but it's been asked back since 1947. And the largest percentage of people are saying we need to stay out, more so than during the Vietnam War era and all kinds of other eras when you might have expected that people would have expressed that particular sentiment. I found that surprising, and yet at the same time, when we look around at the world of consumers these days, we also see a huge emphasis on the whole be American, buy American kind of sentiment. And I'm going to show you a brief Super Bowl ad that I think illustrates well the type of sentiment I'm talking about that's quite prevalent now.
Is there anything more American than America? Because you can't import original. You can't fake true cool. You can't duplicate legacy. Because what Detroit created was a first and became an inspiration to the rest of the world. Yeah, Detroit made cars and cars made America. Making the best, making the finest takes conviction. And you can't import the heart and soul of every man and woman working on the line. You can search the world over for the finer things, but you won't find a match for the American road and the creatures that live on it. Because we believe in the zoom and the roll and the thrust. And when it's made here, it's made with the one thing you can't import from anywhere else. American pride. So let Germany brew your beer. Let Switzerland make your watch. Let Asia assemble your phone. We will build your car. Things are
Okay, I know that's really subtle in terms of the messages trying to get across here. But basically the idea is Americans are cool. Forget about the rest of the world. One of the truly absurd things about this ad, aside from the fact that it's Bob Dylan, is the fact that the car they're showing you there is not assembled in the United States. It's assembled from parts made all over the world, and it's Fiat Chrysler. It's actually an Italian company these days, not an American company. But you get the general idea. This kind of sentiment, this pro-American manifestation of this underlying sense of turning inward and pro-isolationism is something we encounter all the time, and there are scholars who demonstrated that, in fact, people will pay a premium for something that's made in the United States as opposed to another country. What does this all mean, and where do these trade preferences that people have to buy only American goods come from? Well, in international political economy, there's pretty much one answer, and that is it comes from economic self-interest on the part of the worker. But what's surprising about all this is the evidence on which this is based is primarily looking at people's incomes and also especially their levels of education. Education, high levels of education, are very strong predictors of support for free trade. And the assumption was that those who are well educated are less likely to be hurt by trade personally, and that's why they're a lot more supportive than those with less education. But as social scientists, we know that there are a lot of other things that are driven by education as well. And it's not intuitively obvious that that's what education represents when this relationship is found. So together with one of my international political economy colleagues, one of our initial studies was an attempt to find out whether education was really representing what we thought it was. And surprisingly, what we found that people's trade attitudes weren't actually influenced by whether the occupation they were in or the industry that they were in was vulnerable to the effects of trade. We classified things along whether they were, import competing or export oriented or trade neutral kinds of jobs, and that didn't seem to have anything to do with their trade preferences, although education definitely did. We also looked at the communities in which they live. Maybe if you're in a manufacturing community that's been really hard hit by trade, you would be more anti-trade. We didn't find that. We didn't find that people who had lost their jobs were more anti-trade. We also asked people in the context of national surveys whether they thought their place of employment exported, imported, and so on and so forth, and even using their own self-perceived status in the economy didn't predict how they felt about trade. Further, the usual suspects, that is political party, those kinds of identifications are not strong predictors of people's trade attitudes, which makes it a rather unusual issue in the world of public opinion these days. So what did we find? Well, if you look here, what you'll see in the shaded areas of this graph, the shaded bars, it shows the number of Americans, the percentage who say they're affected positively or negatively by trade or not influenced at all. And if you look at that bar in the middle, the tall dark bar, you see that over 60% of Americans say trade has no effect on them and their family financial situation. And in fact, at the moment, that's actually not so far off. Most occupations in the U.S. are neither trade positive or negative. They're actually trade neutral. That may change, obviously, but this is part of the reason that people aren't so much politicizing their own economic self-interest is that most people don't see themselves as affected by trade, whether they are or they aren't in practice. On the other hand, when it comes to perceiving trade as having effects on the U.S. economy, people definitely do perceive that. Slightly more perceive it overall as having detrimental effects than negative, but it's fairly split along those lines. The problem was we had kind of discovered what didn't drive trade attitudes, but we really hadn't made a positive case for what was actually responsible. We know that the perceived collective national interest with respect to trade does seem to matter. It does seem to predict people's trade attitudes. What hadn't been looked at much is how people were affected by how they thought trade affected other countries. Were they concerned about things like effects on the environment or potentially the treatment of workers overseas as a result of trade? Overall, we also have a very thin understanding of how the media covers these issues and what the impact of that coverage is likely to be. So if not self-interest, then what? Well, One of the peculiar findings in our earlier surveys of attitudes toward trade was that very consistently measures of domestic racism predict trade preferences. Higher prejudice levels are linked to anti-trade views. And this is the kind of measure, whether you do it with using racial resentment or you do it having each racial group evaluate other racial groups and make a comparison, regardless of how it was measured, it was a really strong predictor of trade attitudes. And this initially struck us as kind of strange because what does domestic racism have to do with trade? Well, what these things have in common is a tendency to divide the world into us and them, a tendency to think of the world in terms of in-groups and out-groups. And that was really the point of departure for the studies that I'm going to talk about for the most part today, was to look at the role of in-group and out-group tendencies in predicting attitudes toward trade. When we think about things like other globalization views, like let's say immigration, then it becomes a little more logical to people that prejudice matters because they're talking about people coming from other countries to the US. But it's important to note that in the case of trade, we're talking about products coming in and out. We're not talking about human beings for the most part. Nonetheless, it's very much part of the same framework of attitudes toward globalization. So the way I approached this theoretically to begin with was I thought in terms of a standard 2x2 matrix, thinking about how people in the US perceive their country to be helped or hurt by trade, and how they perceived our trading partner countries to be affected by trade. And in the upper left there, you see what I call the standard economist view, and that's the idea that trade is basically a win-win kind of thing, both for the United States and for our trading partner countries, that it helps both entities. And most surveys of economists show that over 90% of economists endorse this viewpoint. Now, they may have quibbles with particular trade agreements and the details, but overall, they're very likely to espouse views that suggest, why not? Everybody wins. There are some economists that are in the lower left-hand cell, what I've labeled zero-sum exploitation, meaning that they see trade agreements as designed to help the United States not only gain, but gain more than other countries and to thus exploit other countries. In the lower right quadrant, we have people who think it's bad for us and bad for them, both the in-group and the out-group, the United States and our trading partner countries. These people tend to be highly isolationist overall, not surprisingly. And then finally, in the upper right-hand cell, is a zero-sum perception of trade that suggests people see it as largely bad for the US, but helping other countries. And as you'll see in a few minutes, that is overwhelmingly where most Americans place themselves with respect to trade. So when we ask people in an open-ended context, after they've told us their trade attitudes, why? What are the reasons that they give for opposing trade? Overwhelmingly, people pick hurting US jobs. That is the major reason for opposition to trade without us telling them anything. The second largest category is that we should put the US first. And again, it's pretty much implying the same thing, that to trade would be not putting the US first and not in the US's best interests. So in terms of the breakdown of the American public, just over 50% of the public espouses the foreign aid view, meaning that they see trade as essentially a form of foreign aid, that we are engaging in a practice that benefits trading partner countries at the expense of the United States. So from that perspective, it's obvious why it's not very popular, because foreign aid itself is not very popular either. But the answer that people give here turns out to be really important for understanding how it falls into this in-group, out-group kind of framework. So what we did is, after we asked people in an open-ended context in a large national survey about their reasons for favoring or opposing trade, we then asked them along a lot of other dimensions, because one of the things that's lacking in our understanding of public opinion about trade is an understanding of how these other dimensions factor in. What about the environment? What about the impact on the cost of goods? Or what about the democratic peace kind of argument? Do people see it as good for national security to trade with other countries and so forth? So we asked about all these different dimensions, both with respect to the United States and with respect to the United States trading partner countries. What we found was, I guess in some ways not surprising, but we found that trade is not particularly multidimensional. And although I know there's certainly interest groups out there that emphasize one dimension or another of these benefits or costs of trade, if you see trade as good for one thing, you see it as good for everything. And when you think about it, that especially makes very little sense in that people, for example, who say it's bad for jobs also say it's terrible for the cost of goods in the United States. And in fact, about 48% of the US public believes that trade raises the cost of consumer goods in this country. So what appears to be going on is you either like it or you hate it. And everything else kind of flows from that overall feeling in terms of whether you think it's good for all of these different dimensions. It's within each of these dimensions also, people are either very positive or very negative for the most part. That is, either they think it's good for jobs in both places or good for cost of goods in both places or bad in both cases. There's one really important exception, and again, I think this underlines why it's become such a contentious issue in the United States. And that one exception is jobs. The more you think it helps the US, the more you think, or the more you think it helps other countries, the more you think it hurts the US. And looking across these bars here, they represent, the height represents the extent to which you think it helps versus hurts the US and its trading partner countries. And what you'll notice is in that 5 of these 7 dimensions, the mean is significantly higher in terms of it helping trading partner countries. There are 2 exceptions, are the cost of goods, where it's much more even, and the U.S. Sees itself as having slightly more benefits than harm, and the environment, where again, the U.S. the white bar is slightly higher than the benefits for trading partner countries. But jobs in particular has this enormous gap, and in fact, rather than being positively correlated, as I mentioned all these other measures are, these two are strongly negatively correlated. So you see it very much in zero-sum terms, as if there's a finite number of jobs, and if you move them from here to there, then this place gets less and this place gets more. Well, you have to ask yourself, if people think that this is harmful to the US for the most part, why do they think we do it? And here I turn to popular books on the global economy, the kind that you can pick up in an airport bookstore. And they were actually very useful for these purposes because there's a certain narrative that flows through these books. And basically it goes like this. If trade benefits them at the expense of the US, the only way to explain it is it's about greed versus loyalty to one's country. Corporate greed leads top executives to sell out the American worker in favor of greater profits for themselves. So that's the main storyline that kind of explains US involvement in trade in many popular books and articles these days. But what's interesting is if you read these books a little further, and this is actually from that same one, you'll find that they're a little more nuanced than that. They actually do say that trade maximizes collective benefits. They just argue that that's not good enough because it doesn't maximize in-group benefits. So to give you an example here from one of the pages, his firm's investment committee discusses the question of who wins and loses in today's economy. He said one of his senior colleagues had argued that the hollowing out of the American middle class didn't really matter. His point, the CEO explained, was that if the transformation of the world economy lifts 4 people in China and India out of poverty and into the middle class, and meanwhile means 1 American drops out of the middle class, that's not such a bad trade. Now, the authors of this book feel, obviously, that that isn't a good trade, and as they continue, the only problem is that no one told working Americans they were going to forfeit their future so that people in China, India, Brazil, and other developing countries could become part of a global middle class. So they are acknowledging collective benefit. It's just not collective benefits for the in-group nation. So this is what really led me to my studies of things other than self-interest that will predict trade attitudes. And the first one is a fairly simple and obvious one, and that is the idea that people favor their national in-group strictly because they're all members of the same country, what I call the compatriotism hypothesis. And what I consider evidence of this in my studies is if they follow a strategy that maximizes the in-group benefit rather than the maximum collective benefit for everyone. So that's one form of in-group favoritism. The second form of in-group favoritism comes out of some of Jim Sidanius's work here at Harvard, and he calls this form of in-group favoritism Vladimir's choice, and it comes from an old Eastern European folktale. And the story goes like this. Vladimir is a peasant, and one day late in his life, God comes to him and says, Vladimir, you've been a good man. I'm going to grant you one thing that you want, anything in the world. You just tell me what it is. But there's a catch, and that catch is whatever I give to you, I give to your neighbor Ivan twice over. So Vladimir thinks about it for a minute, and he says, okay, fine, take one of my eyes out. Okay, now Vladimir is not better off. However, relative to Ivan, he's a lot better off because Ivan can't see at all, and he has at least one eye. So this is a case where what matters to him is his relative advantage over his neighbor. This is a second form of in-group favoritism that we also see with respect to trade. There are certain kinds of people that we know are especially likely to exhibit this kind of intergroup competition perspective on in-group favoritism. And first of all, if they choose something that isn't necessarily good for them, but because it puts them above some other group or above some other individual, then we know they're trying to maximize the relative in-group benefit, not just the overall benefit. So one group very susceptible to this particular tendency are people who are high in what's known as social dominance orientation. And again, this is a concept that also comes out of Jim Sidanius's work, but it basically is a short scale that taps people's belief in group hierarchy, the appropriateness of group hierarchy. Should some groups have authority over others, and so forth. So we'd expect people with a high degree of social dominance, it matters to them who's on top, to be especially likely to care about relative gains over absolute gains. The second characteristic that we know exacerbates this tendency is when you perceive something to be a zero-sum game. So to the extent that you believe trade is zero-sum, like those people in the upper right-hand corner of my 2x2 matrix, if they think they only win if somebody else loses, then they're very likely to also exhibit a preference for relative gains over absolute gains. So what I did to look at this was I had a large-scale survey of the American population, about 3,000 people, and I did what's known as a survey experiment. And for those of you who don't know that term, it's basically like doing any other experiment, except that rather than using college sophomores or a convenient sample of people, you use a representative sample of the population to execute your experimental design. And this particular one is done on the web in order to make that possible. Basically, there are two experimental factors here. One is who gains and who loses from a trade policy that's described to the public. In one set of conditions, the U.S. gains and the trading partner loses. In another, the trading partner gains, same amount, and the U.S. loses. And then in a third condition, both gain. And this is really the condition that is meant to simulate the view of trade. That is, everybody gets something out of it. It's a win-win kind of scenario. The numbers across the top refer to how much is gained or lost by each party in each condition, because we did vary that as well to see how much difference it really made. So this is the actual description of the policy we gave people. The words that are in yellow change if you were in a lose or a gain scenario, and the numbers obviously changed. And all we did was ask people on a 1 to 4 scale how much they'd support this particular trade policy. So to test the compatriotism hypothesis, we compare conditions where the absolute gain is the same, but in one case it's the U.S. that's gaining more. In the other case, it is the trading partner country that is gaining. And not surprisingly, there's a huge preference for the policy that benefits the U.S. over the trading partner. Now, in looking at this, you know, one of the things that immediately occurred to me, and the reason we did the varying the amount of gain and loss, is surely there's some level of trading partner gain and some low level of loss in the U.S. that would raise people's level of support for the policy. And when I initially did this, I pre-tested it on a convenient sample of people, and this is what I found. If you look at the two lines, the green line shows you if the U.S. gains some amount and the trading partner loses, how much support for trade they exhibit. And as you can see, if the U.S. gains only 1 and the trading partner loses 1,000, support is very low. Vice versa, if you say the U.S. loses only 1 and the trading partner gains 1,000, you have a higher level of support, not surprisingly. And this simply shows the means at each of those points. But the most important thing to note here is that the lines cross, meaning that there is a point at which we can say how much one American is worth. In this particular sample, one American is worth 25 foreigners. And as crass as that may sound, basically in weighing gains and losses, at a certain point, if there's 25 or more gains, on the other side, people are willing to support it at the same level that they would otherwise. But as I mentioned, this was a convenient sample. I did it mainly to make sure people understood the treatments and could answer them and so forth. In that same convenient sample, quite logically, when you gave people the gain-gain scenario, they're far more supportive of trade, as shown in the yellow line here. Because what's not to like if everybody wins? Unfortunately, a representative sample of the United States didn't look quite the same. And in fact, what you see here is when we go to a representative national sample, the lines never cross, at least not when we go up to 1,000 people. If they do cross, it's at a much greater number of foreigners than only 25 or even 1,000 here. So basically what we see is no amount of trading partner gain will compel Americans to support trade in the absence of the gains for the U.S. itself. The other thing that's kind of surprising about this is that I looked and looked for subgroups that perhaps showed this pattern of crossing over, and the only one I was able to find was people who are low in social dominance, people who don't believe in hierarchy. They're far more oriented toward egalitarianism. At 1 American to 1,000 foreigners, those lines do in fact meet, strictly for those in low social dominance. But doesn't matter, you can look at liberals and conservatives and all kinds of subgroups and not find any point at which they meet. After they were asked the question about the trade policy, we asked people to tell us what kinds of things they were thinking about as they answered the question. And I found reading through these a very sobering experience for reasons you'll understand. People were very forthright in saying that the priority for our care should be our own people. we need to help ourselves first. I think the U.S. should require 2 U.S. jobs for each foreign jobs. I think we need to take care of our own first. That's what's most natural, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot, I'll be honest, this is just a tiny sample. There are a lot of very, very vitriolic, bitter comments of this kind. But I can also say that there are some comments that are totally the opposite. There are people who basically thought this through and said outright, at the end of the day, humanity, not nationality, is what matters. And basically, these are people who realize the tremendous importance of where you're born. And they would say things along the lines that people shouldn't be favored because of where they live. Some said they have more to gain than we have to lose from that trade-off on a basic human level. And I particularly like this last one. It's a numbers game, have to consciously suppress tribalism. So obviously some people are very aware that this in-group, out-group kind of thing is going on when they think about policies of this kind. But we had purposely set up the policies to involve gains and losses of various kinds. In some cases, people berated the United States for engaging in trade, saying that basically we're just too darn generous, that we need to help ourselves, and how do we become the world's savior, and so on and so forth, and suggesting that the politicians should move there and give all their money away, and so forth. So you get the general idea in these statements of what people are thinking about. And this is across all of the experimental conditions, not one in particular here. Basically, the bottom line from this first finding is that putting Americans first is a highly socially acceptable form of in-group favoritism. Obviously, as a political psychologist, we spend lots and lots of time and effort trying to tap attitudes that we think are so socially undesirable that people won't express them publicly. People didn't seem to have any trouble expressing their feelings on this issue, and they didn't seem to have qualms about the social desirability of doing so. Further, you get, even though I'm talking mainly about trade today, just as trade groups these issues like immigration and trade and so forth, so too we see hugely similar patterns in attitudes toward other issues as well. The whole point being, whether you think it has a negative impact on jobs in the US or you see it as hurting American jobs, you think that, as one respondent put it, Americans are more deserving of those jobs. And people express that quite forcefully in the answers. Now, there is another way to view this, and you could say we're really not being very fair here in this characterization of this as in-group favoritism, because couldn't people feel like it's a duty or obligation of citizenship to help their less fortunate compatriots who need work? And so I did quite a bit of investigating this particular possibility, and my conclusion thus far is probably not. And the reason I say that is that what we find is that when it comes to caring for the American in-group, Americans show very little enthusiasm for helping other national in-group members that are in need, whether it's social welfare policies or health care or other things of this kind. Now, if they can personally select who the beneficiaries are, for example, if it's charitable giving or volunteerism, then they will make these choices to give. But basically, as in many highly heterogeneous societies, we don't see this strong tendency to take care of one's compatriots. And in fact, when it comes to things like social welfare, the more strongly you identify as American, the less supportive you are of social welfare types of policies in the US. So again, this is to be investigated further, but it's pretty difficult to argue that they feel this overwhelming desire to take care of one another as compatriots. Now, there's one group of people, I call them the oxygen mask argument people, because they seem to understand that what they are saying is definitely in-group favoritism, but they have a justification for that in-group favoritism that's exactly like what you get on the airplane when they tell you you've got to put your oxygen mask on first so you'll be able to help the person next to you afterward. And many people virtually said that word for word. We need to support our own country before assisting others. Then we should help the less fortunate after. We're all okay. If we don't take care of our own first, how can we be expected to help our neighbors when we are in such need ourselves? And so on and so forth. So the idea here is it's not that we don't want to, accidentally help someone else. It's that we need to take care of ourselves first in order to be of use. So just to give you an idea as I leave aside these open-ended comments, one of the fascinating things to me is the difference in levels of in-group favoring and out-group denigrating comments versus the opposite in these different conditions. When trade is framed as something where the U.S. loses and the trading partner gains, you get a huge amount of vitriol. You get a lot of nastiness about foreigners and so on and so forth. That gets less when the U.S. gains and the trading partner loses, and it gets lower still, although it's still at 23% of people who made comments of that kind when the U.S. gains and the trading partner gains. So even when everyone wins, there's a fair amount of that sentiment coming forth. Okay, the second hypothesis I think is even more problematic in a lot of ways, the evidence of it, and that is the idea of Vladimir's choice or intergroup competition. The idea that even when we both win, we might not be happy about it because it doesn't advantage us over another country in competitive terms. So these are just the means in trade support when the U.S. gains and the trading partner loses versus the U.S. gains and the trading partner gains. Now, you might think, what's not to like when everybody gains? And they're gaining the same amount in these overall in these two scenarios. But there's no difference in levels of support for trade, regardless of whether it's a win-win or win for the U.S. and loss for our trading partner countries. So very little evidence that people care a lot about the impact on other countries. In reality, though, what we're looking at here hides two very distinct patterns. Here is the same graph that we looked at earlier, but in this case, also showing you the win-win line, the yellow line. And as you can see, there's no difference between the win-win scenario in levels of support and the one where only the U.S. wins. So people seem to be using strictly how much the in-group gains as the primary basis for their decision. However, what's interesting is if you look at people who are high in this social dominance kind of orientation, they're actually significantly less supportive of trade if it benefits the trading partner country. So basically, they care more about relative advantage. For those who are low in social dominance, it actually increases support. And those two groups are largely canceling one another out in the overall means that we saw there. But basically, if you care about your position relative to others, you are far more favorable when your side gains and the other side loses. Same thing is true looking at whether or not people see trade in zero-sum terms. If they see it as something that is a zero-sum game, then they are less likely to support it when it's a win-win scenario. And that makes perfect sense because if me winning means somebody else has to lose and vice versa, then obviously it makes a lot more sense for them in terms of relative gains to oppose trade when everybody gains from it. The other thing that's fascinating about intergroup competition is it does a really good job explaining a lot of the demographic differences that we see with respect to trade attitudes. For example, women tend to be more anti-trade than our men, and that's a very consistent finding. But if you look at the win-win policy, women are actually significantly more supportive. Men, on the other hand, are more supportive when the other side loses, thus reflecting higher levels of competitiveness in that group. It also explains the bizarre kinds of things that we see with Republicans and Democrats these days. Traditionally, we think of Republicans as being pro-trade because of their strong belief in market values and so forth. And yet, what we see here is in the U.S. wins, trading partner loses condition. Yes, Republicans are indeed more supportive of trade. But in the U.S. wins, trading partner wins condition, it's Democrats that are a lot more supportive of trade. So obviously, how one views any particular trade policy or arrangement is not something we're examining here, but it tells us why, for different reasons, both political parties find a lot to dislike about trade these days. So the next step in this project was to look a bit at what our opinion leaders were saying about trade. How are they articulating to the American public what one should think about trade? And to give you a sense of this, here are two quick ads from the most recent presidential election.
Fewer Americans are working today than when President Obama took office. It doesn't have to be this way. If Obama would stand up to China. China is stealing American ideas and technology, everything from computers to fighter jets. 7 times Obama could have taken action. 7 times he said no. His policies cost us 2 million jobs. Obama had years to stand up to China. We can't afford 4 more.
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message. It's time to stand up to the cheaters and make sure we protect jobs for the American people.
Mitt Romney, tough on China? Romney's companies were called pioneers in shipping U.S. manufacturing jobs overseas. He invested in firms that specialized in relocating jobs to low-wage countries like China. Even today, part of Romney's fortune is invested in China. Romney's never stood up to China. All he's done is send them our jobs.
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
Okay, so as you can see, the candidates were both saying, you know, let's beat up on China. And in fact, the China bashing ads took a huge proportion, I can't remember the exact percentage offhand, of the advertising budgets of both candidates. So what we see in trends in public opinion is around election time, everybody becomes more anti-trade. The candidates are, in effect, leading in many cases in this position, but we see the dip happen in public opinion as well during election years. And no doubt we're going to see it again in this particular year based on what's happened thus far. So one of the interesting things is what kind of effect does this have, given that the voices we're hearing on both sides of the political spectrum are very much that this is dangerous, this is harmful, and so forth. Well, in collaboration with one of my graduate students, we did an experiment using those very ads. And people just saw one of those ads, and then like 30 or 40 minutes later, after doing something else, they were given a task that involved admitting undergraduates to a college. And so they are given a whole big list of different college students, and the different descriptions of these college students' skills and accomplishments and all that are randomly assigned to each of the different pictures and so forth. But what was systematically varied in this Latin square design was the nationality of the student, and secondly, whether they were Chinese, separately, whether they were Chinese American or not. And maybe not surprisingly, although I think it's a very sad kind of statement about our politics, in the study of who should be admitted, those who had been randomly assigned to see the anti-China ad rather than just a product ad systematically discriminated more in admissions against both Chinese nationals and also Chinese Americans. So what this suggests is that when political leaders use this issue for purposes of getting more votes, it's not without its consequences for other aspects of society as well. The idea of the Chinese and threatening and so forth trickles down even to American citizens of Chinese descent. In case I haven't made this point clear, it's not about the jobs and the economy, strictly speaking. And this slide shows you what I think many people find quite surprising, and that is if we look at members of minority groups, non-whites and whites. We see a difference here. Let me see if I can use my pointer. If you look at the red line on the bottom, that's when the U.S. loses and the trading partner gains. Minorities are much more supportive of trade than are whites over here. And overall, their means are very different regardless of condition. Now, what's interesting about this is if you're thinking about this in terms of who has the kind of jobs most susceptible to being displaced by competition, it's minorities. They actually are more vulnerable to the impact of trade than are whites on the whole. So it's surprising and further indicative, I think, of this fact that it's not just about economic vulnerability. To the extent that that plays a role, it's not a very big one. The sense of in-group, out-group kinds of animosity plays a large role in where people stand on this issue. So what about news coverage? As you know, I'm somebody who likes to study political communication in particular, so I began collecting huge databases of all references to globalization and to trade in particular for this project as well. Surprisingly, until this year, there have been relatively small amounts of coverage, and they're primarily negative. They're about job loss, overwhelmingly. But one of the more fascinating things about this is how they're covered. The harms of globalization of trade in particular, job loss, are concrete. They're easy to observe and easy to report on for reporters. They go and they interview the poor person whose job has disappeared and been sent to China or whatever the case might be. On the other hand, job gains are reported on very differently. When they're covered, they're presented in very abstract terms, and it's very difficult to humanize the coverage of job gains because it tends to be many steps along the process. What we know from political psychology is people are likely to think about losses very differently from how they think about gains. So what I embedded in this larger experiment is a look at how differences in the type of media coverage that are received by winners and losers impact attitudes about trade. And I'll be honest, this is from when I first started this project. I Googled job loss. Google image search, just randomly what happened to come up. And what you get are these pictures of mainly white men looking sad because they have pink slips in hand. You also get that one about the have PhD, finished 3 postdocs. Graduate students in the audience, please don't look. It's very depressing. In any case, when you put in job gain or job creation, what you get is this. You get a bunch of abstract statistics, and that's very consistent with how we see trade being covered, the gains and losses of trade. Certainly, it has both gains and losses, but they aren't framed at all in the same way. We know that people's judgments about policies are commonly influenced by the kind of mental imagery that we think about when an issue is brought up. And what we know from previous studies is that negative consequences are a lot easier to visualize than positive ones. And for that reason, I hypothesize that trade losers are going to be more vivid in people's minds than are trade winners. Secondly, I also hypothesized, based on a lot of previous research, that in those scenarios where we say one loser versus saying 1,000 losers, that the kind of sympathy or empathy that is evoked for those losers will be far less when it's 1,000 losers than when it's just one. We know that the one often creates very vivid images in our mind that statistics do not, especially when they're large and abstract. So we predicted that the one person affected would be more vivid than the many. These illustrations of these findings come from the open-ended comments people gave. First of all, losers were a lot more vivid. People said, I pictured in my mind the people who would be jobless. I pictured the people who would automatically lose their jobs, and so on and so forth. Second hypothesis was also confirmed. That is, People, regardless of whether the one person was a foreigner or an American, they pictured that one person far more vividly than they pictured in their mind's eye the large collective. I pictured the people affected, but more so the single person who wouldn't be able to support their family. Abstract thought seems to be a necessary condition for understanding both the gains and losses that come from trade. I found it fascinating that respondents said things like, I didn't picture real people, but rather abstract people, such as on a chart. Just like the image from the Google image search, people who think in terms of abstract numbers find it easier to see this as advantageous. So just to summarize where I am with this project so far, we know that in-group favoritism matters a lot to trade preferences and in multiple different ways, both via compatriotism and through this kind of intergroup competition that makes people unhappy even with trade policies they perceive to be helping both us and our trading partners. What's more, media coverage really makes it easier for us to focus on individuals as opposed to groups, as well as on loss. So, why did people favor trade in the beginning? We have this tendency now to see trade as about competition. And that lends itself really easily to this intergroup competition way of viewing the world, where we're only happy if we beat the other guy. Well, if you go back to the ancient Phoenicians who developed these keeled boats that were capable of finally going out in the big ocean and trading with others, what they cared about was consumer goods, basically. The stuff they could get from being able to trade. And this is a quote from Plutarch, who argued that the sea brought the Greeks the vine from India, from Greece transmitted the use of grain across the sea, from Phoenicia imported letters as a memorial against forgetfulness, thus preventing the greater part of mankind from being wineless, grainless, and unlettered. So this is obviously not a competitive framework, and if you read things from that era, it was seen as a way to get things you couldn't otherwise get. Interestingly, among Americans who do favor trade, other than those who just say it generally helps the economy, the most common positive statement is that it improves their access to goods. So in some ways, things haven't changed. What resonates with the American public is not theories of, comparative advantage and specialization and so forth. It's access to goods. And in fact, in some countries, that is quite salient as a means for supporting trade. Obviously, the same kind of in-group favoritism and the same kind of attitudes that I'm talking about are playing a big role in politics these days. So I have just recently collected some data from a large-scale panel that goes back several years. And when we look at what drives support for Donald Trump, measures of racial prejudice support it, and these things all at the same time support it. Anti-trade views encourage support for trade, anti-immigration views independent of that, and people with a very high level of social dominance orientation, which I would bet you Trump would score quite high on the SDO index. So all of the kinds of things that we're talking about, the need to win, 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 and dominate others and be the best and the top and first and so forth, all of those kinds of things and those reasons for favoring him are part of the same complex of attitudes and ways of viewing the world. One of the things I find particularly disappointing, I guess is the best word for it, about the politicians we're looking at these days is that basically because public opinion sees trade and sees globalization as a fairly frightening kind of development, we see politicians, regardless of party, backing away from free trade. And rather than embracing it, but saying, hey, we need to do something about workers who lose their jobs due to trade, We need to worry about compensation and job retraining and so forth, which is inevitably going to be part of our future. We have things like, oh, let's put up walls, which is obviously a metaphor for the very same kind of thing we're talking about, cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world. Whether it's due to technology or if it's due to globalization, jobs are going to disappear. We know that. Trade both eliminates jobs and creates jobs. But we really don't want people to be employed as pin setters anymore. I'm assuming we don't have a need for pin setters. Same thing is true. We don't need switchboard operators anymore. So it doesn't make sense to save those jobs as a means of saving the livelihood of the people who hold those jobs. So what I'm waiting for is a politician who will both embrace the benefits as well as the risks of trade and be willing to put forth policies that actually create the kind of reassurance that people need in order to feel like it's okay to open up the United States to the rest of the world. I'm going to stop there and open things up for questions. Thank you very much.